Good morning and good afternoon to everybody. I welcome you all from, in fact, 26 countries across the globe. These were the people who have registered to our EMEA webinar, which is the second from the EMEA webinars for cycle. So our webinar today is on biodiversity and climate change, lessons for the Mediterranean Sea. So this webinar is organized to also launch the EMEA Policy Research Initiative on Bioeconomics in the Mediterranean and Africa. Its main aim is to develop the research in this area with a focus on these regions, and also to promote the mainstreaming of nature-based solutions to tackle climate change consequences into economics, finance, and policy. We will focus on the conservation, the protection, and also the contribution of nature ecosystems, while also making socioeconomic and financial value more sustainable. In line with the research work we did on the TRIS development model we launched and published this year. So actually we had a very interesting meeting on in July to discuss the TRIS development model. So for those who did not follow us on this presentation, the TRIS stands for transparent, responsible, inclusive, and sustainable. Among others, and I think this is what we have tried to develop in this model, we are trying to target to move from today's machine-centric production and addicted consumption models to human and responsible models for production and for consumption, underpinned in eco-awareness driven behaviors. And this is extremely important to move in the Horizon 2050 for this type of models, not only in the Mediterranean and Africa, but possibly in other parts of the world. With this work, we are aiming to contribute to the green and blue economy strategies in the Mediterranean, Africa, and beyond those two regions. Today, I am deeply honored and thrilled to welcome this very important lineup of very distinguished speakers from different disciplines and from different parts of the world, and all the participants who registered in this webinar, not only on screen, but also on the Facebook, because we are live streaming. So for the next steps, EMEA team will later publish this recording of this webinar for whoever could not join us online today. And also a report will summarize the main discussion points and the next steps. So let me start with this very important webinar. So the objective of our discussion today is to dive into a dialogue between economics, law, policy, and natural ecosystems in order to bring out a new perspective, the so-called blue economy or renewed blue economy for the Mediterranean region, which is also embedded into the green transition. So let me welcome our keynote speaker. I'm very happy to have Sylvia Earle with us, who is an oceanographer and also an explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society, also world known for her research on marine ecosystems, and also on her books and also documentaries and TED Talks. I mean, I'm a fan of Sylvia, and I'm sure many also are. She's also the founder of the Mission Blue, the founder of Deep Ocean Exploration and Research, a founding ocean elder. Also, she's the honorary chair of the Advisory Council of the Harte Research Institute. She has been since always committed to the oceans and the sea and to the struggle to revert the disastrous consequences of the climate change on the oceans and on our seas. Sylvia, you're joining us very early in the morning from Oakland in California today. Thank you again for being with us, for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours. Please, Sylvia.
I can drive submarines, but I have to remember to unmute.
Yes.
So thank you for this honor, this opportunity to, on behalf of one species, humankind, to say thank you for the rest of the species on the planet, for keeping us alive. Without the rest of life on Earth, our life would not be possible. One of the great things about being a human is to understand what other creatures cannot, and what even my fellow humans who preceded just about now, the present time, could not understand. We are really blessed to be around early in the 21st century as humans measure time, and to be armed with that most vital thing, knowledge, that leads to understanding, that with luck will lead to a caring and an understanding that we must take care of the rest of life on Earth. As smart as they are, elephants cannot know what the children of today have available to them. They cannot see, whales cannot see, tunas in the ocean cannot see Earth from space. In fact, having some humans up in the sky looking back on Earth and understanding that the world is all connected, and to have those who have been privileged to go deep in the ocean and to realize that the ocean is not just water, it's alive. So we're putting the focus today on climate change and the diversity of life. It really comes down to understanding something so basic that it ought to be taught along with our alphabet, along with our numbers at the earliest stage. It's about the carbon cycle. It's about how life on Earth connects and how it's great to be human, but we must understand that without the rest of life on Earth, our existence would not be possible. So carbon, it's one of the most common elements in the universe. We are carbon-based units. Photosynthesis, that magic process that again should be taught at the earliest stages in schools, about how carbon dioxide in the atmosphere occurs in just a small amount, parts per thousand in the atmosphere. It would seem a trivial thing, except that it's a vital thing. CO2 plus water yields sugar, yields the food that we all rely on, but it's true of much of life on Earth. Now, there is chemosynthesis in the deep sea that doesn't rely on sunlight. It doesn't even require carbon dioxide, but it does require water. All life requires water, which is the other thing that we should be teaching at the very earliest stages of being a human. To understand the world around us, how lucky we are to be conscious, aware of who we are, where we've come from, and maybe most importantly, where we might be going forward. Throughout all of human history, we have taken for granted our existence. We've used wildlife as products, whether it's from the land or from the sea. We've clear-cut forests, thinking that the most valuable thing that a forest delivers to us, board feet of lumber, or the space that is occupied by forests that we would like to use for other purposes, to plant cities, to plant ourselves in place of what was there during preceding times. But this point in time, for the first time, we are able to calculate our impact our prosperity, just in the most recent times, I think starting around 1800 is a good milestone because it's when our population, our success as a species, reached that point of 1 billion of us, around 1800. Well, here we are, 220 years later, with about 8 times that number. And by the middle of the century, it's projected that we might be 10 times that number, at the cost of all of the rest of life on Earth. Well, if we did not know this, if we did not see our impact, we would really be in trouble. But the great news is we can see and measure and calculate our impact on our life support system, the systems that keep us alive, on the carbon cycle, looking at how natural solutions to addressing the crisis that we now face in terms of changing climate. Okay, I'm sitting here in California. With every breath I take here, I realize the impact of what we're doing to the natural world, burning the forests, not deliberately. We aren't out just setting fire to the carbon-based units that we call trees and all of the rest of the life that lives in forests that is now turned to dust that's in the atmosphere that I am breathing. We now can see the consequences of our actions. We have a chance as never before, maybe as never again, to take what we now know and realize, as many do, look, we have a chance to keep oil and gas and coal in the ground, what's still there, to look for alternatives as methods that we know how to do this in terms of harnessing alternatives to power our civilization. We realize that there are limits to how many of us the planet can really continue to support and still have a viable system. But we're just beginning to recognize that this conference today is focusing on is how keeping the carbon in the forests, keeping the carbon in the ocean, looking at the value of living trees, the value of whales in the ocean, and dare I say, looking at the Mediterranean and looking at the image behind me, the value of tuna left in the ocean. We have developed these habits of consuming wildlife as if it will always be there, no matter how much we take. We think of nature as being infinitely resilient. In spite of the evidence, now we know. We have the information. We have the numbers. There's no excuse anymore, for example, of treating ocean wildlife simply as commodities. We have made a transition with respect to whales. One of my fellow panelists, speaking right after me, Ralph Chami, has been among those taking the lead in celebrating the value of the carbon in whales. I mean, it seems so obvious to a biologist. It should be obvious to everyone. It isn't just whales. It isn't just trees. All life. We're all carbon-based units. We all have to think differently about how we treat the living planet. And I would like to put a special emphasis on the living ocean, because that's where most of the taking up of carbon dioxide occurs, and it is stored from the very smallest microbes, the little creatures, the phytoplankton, that do the heavy lifting in the ocean, and really for the planet as a whole, about driving the carbon cycle, taking up carbon dioxide, turning it into sugar, into food, that becomes small fish, larger fish, becomes squid, becomes tuna, becomes whales. Actually, of course, becomes us. We are carbon-based units too. But we have become a dominant force driving the way the planet functions. We have to understand how we can fit in to the natural systems and to respect the diversity of life for all of the values that it provides to maintaining a hospitable planet. Now, it's baffling to me as a marine scientist to recognize that we have come a long way toward respecting the diversity of life on land. Not far enough, but at least there are whole organizations devoted to taking care of wild creatures that we have come to respect on the land. But when you look at the ocean, wildlife there, it's the biggest wildlife trade on the planet, taking wild animals from the sea. We call them fish, as if it's kind of one thing, fish. But we're looking at literally thousands of different species that we think of, our fellow vertebrates, that we think of primarily as commodities. We should just change our way of thinking about wildlife in the ocean. With whales, there was a time when they were just regarded as commodities, pounds of meat, barrels of oil, measured by the ton, not as individuals. But we're still measuring tuna and squid and herring and cod, all of life in the sea, measured by the ton, not as individuals, not accorded the same kind of respect that we're beginning to understand and respect wildlife on the land. We know better. And of course, we take from the land, we have, and we always will. We take from the sea, we have, we always will. But there are limits to how much we can take and still have a planet that works in our favor. I want to salute those of you who are participating, my fellow panelists, but also those of you who are tuning in, and to realize how lucky we are to have this opportunity before it's too late. While we still do have bluefin tuna, we still have cod in the ocean, there's still squid. And there are more whales today than there were when I was a child, because we did take seriously the importance of having whales alive. Originally, not for the reasons that we're looking at today, as a climate factor, blue carbon, if you will, green carbon, natural solutions, working with nature to hold the planet steady, keeping the trees in the ground, keeping the fish to the extent that we can. We're taking far too many ocean creatures out of the sea and disrupting the carbon cycle in the process. Not just what we take out, burning the carbon as it is taken from the sea, but just as when you burn a forest, you're disrupting the carbon capture mechanisms. And when we take wildlife out of the ocean, we're breaking those links in the carbon capturing mechanisms. We've disrupted the very systems that keep us alive. So I salute all of you for listening and thinking about what you individually and together we can do to go from where we are to planetary decline. And let this be a turning point, armed with a superpower of knowledge, getting our values straight. What is a planet that works in our favor worth? How do you calculate the monetary value of life itself? That's where we are at this point. We can see a catastrophic endpoint if we continue doing what we're currently doing. Or we still have a chance. as never before, maybe as never again, to turn from decline to recovery and true, sustainable prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, for very inspiring talk. I think this has to, I am really, thank you very much. I think this is a very important message to all of the people, but also the economists, the finance people who are in fact also funding boats and ships for fishing the tuna in the oceans in Africa. And there are some big scandals nowadays that even some of this money has disappeared in corruption and in other things. So I absolutely agree with you. The model, or the economic model that nowadays is really based to extract, it's an extractive model to a limit where in reality it hasn't served much, because it has in fact increased inequality of the globe. And at the same time, we are seeing some of the consequences because of this pandemic, for example, that we're living today. So I think it is clear to many, and at least it is also clear to me, that we need to move to a complete different socioeconomic model that takes into account the diversity, biodiversity, and also our natural ecosystem, not only the oceans, the lands, but also what is inside the land. In fact, the natural resources, the gold, the diamond, all the natural resources also that are extremely extracted just to make money out of it. And I'm not even sure what is the value of all of this. So thank you again for this great talk, and we will come back with some questions after the panelists. I would like now to move to my friend and colleague, Ralph Chami. Ralph, he is an assistant director at the International Monetary Fund, at the Institute for Capacity Development. He is also a member of the advisory board of the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association, and I'm very happy that with Ralph, we have been talking a lot about these matters, about sustainable development, about all the work he has been doing, in fact, since last year, on the nature-based solutions to tackle climate change detriment. And he has published very novel work on the valuation of marine species, and currently also working on other interesting projects. I think, Ralph, thank you very much for the great work that you're doing for biodiversity and to preserve and to protect the natural, I would say, the natural resources we have in the planet. Please, Ralph, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rym, for the wonderful invitation. I'm a bit nervous because I'm sharing a panel with my hero, Sylvia, and fellow colleagues. This is really wonderful to be part of this gathering. So, I mean, with the words that Sylvia had, put out to us, the question is, how do we go from what we know now, what we can say we didn't know before, but those that see the light and walk away from the light, they walk away from the light at their own peril. So now that we see the light, what can we do with that? What can we do with all this knowledge? So that's what I'd like to do, is go through the view of the ocean, really from an ocean that is a victim of our own making, a victim of acidification, of pollution, of, as Sylvia put it, assuming that nature will always be there, that nature is always infinite. And actually, at some point, hopefully we get in the discussion, as I have an idea of how we ended up where we are, where we veered away, where humans veered away from their natural world. But I'll get back to that. So let me, since I'm the economist among, well, there are finance people here who agree, but sort of I'm putting the economic case for how we can move forward. Let me go directly to that. So how do we move from the idea of the ocean as a victim to what I call the ocean actually as a champion of tomorrow. It's always been there. It's there's nothing, as Napoleon would say, there's nothing new under the sun. It's just that we're kind of like rediscovering what we used to know and we've forgotten. And so if you allow me to share my screen with you, let me see. All right. Are you able?
Yes, very good.
Okay. Do you see it in the which mode? Is it in the here, let me make sure it's in the, okay, voila. Okay. So in order to build the case for the economy, the ocean economy, it's very important to ground ourselves in the science. Of course, Sylvia's work and other people's work is telling us new things about the ocean. And so at least let's base it on what we know, because we obviously the ocean, we have to always remind ourselves that the ocean is 4/5 of the planet, that everything we do on this land is really 1/5 of the planet. And the rest to us is a mystery that Sylvia and others have been uncovering slowly. But what is it that we know from their work? This is coming from NASA. Oceans are the lungs of the planet. And in the oceans live these wonderful microscopic organisms called phytoplankton. And it turns out that the phytoplankton produce 50% of all the oxygen, the flow of oxygen that is out there. And as some would say, that means they're responsible for every other breath that you and I take. That's 50%, right? So in terms of the flip side of producing oxygen is absorbing carbon dioxide. And it turns out that the phytoplankton is thought to capture at least 30% of all CO2 out there. And so that to bring it home to the rest of us that are not scientists, what does that mean? That means phytoplankton capture carbon dioxide on a yearly basis equivalent to that captured by 1.7 trillion trees. If you like the Amazon and you're enamored with the Amazon, which plays a very important role, the phytoplankton capture 4 times the amount of carbon dioxide that the Amazon forest captures, okay, per year. What else do we know? We also know that in the ocean, there's these wonderful creatures called whales. I mean, there are many wonderful other creatures, but whales is just one example. It turns out that the science tells us that whales capture carbon on their body, about 33, and carbon about 9 tons on average, which is equivalent to 33 tons of carbon dioxide. And more importantly, whales play an important role in the cycle of life, because these, I'm talking about the great whales, the baleen whales, they like to eat krill, and krill likes phytoplankton. And the whales figured that much out. They're very smart creatures, so they decided to fertilize the phytoplankton by, some of us have had breakfast, some of us had lunch, through their poop. So the whales, by pooping, they fertilize the phytoplankton. Remember, the phytoplankton are the lungs of the planet. And so they fertilize the phytoplankton, which increases their productivity, which creates more food for the krill. And the krill is what really the whales need to eat. So in a sense, the whales are fertilizing their own food. So it turns out that when you add up what the whales capture in terms of carbon dioxide on their body, and indirectly through the fertilization of the phytoplankton, one whale in terms of carbon dioxide capture is equivalent to thousands of trees, thousands of trees. In fact, on its body alone, the whale captures the equivalent of 1,500 trees. Okay, but what else do whales do? Well, it turns out that, of course, more whales, when you have a healthy whale population, you have a healthy biosystem around it, and therefore people have studied that when there are more whales, there are actually more fish. And we know I'm a market economist, just like Rym, and we like to look at markets. The market for the overall fishing market is about $375 billion market a year. But here I'm only talking about wild fishing, okay? So not farm fishing. And every dot on this chart, every dot is equivalent to $1 million. Every dot that you see here is $1 million. So the more whales, that means more fish, and the fishing industry, the wild fishing industry, is 150 billion, to which the whales contribute to. What else do whales do? Well, the whales do a lot of things, but the ones that we can measure, whale watching industry is a vibrant industry, and it's growing by leaps and bounds, and it's estimated, just ticket sales, about $2 billion a year. So these are the things that come to us through the science that we're able to kind of measure in price, in sort of markets for which we have prices, for which we have value. So what I'm talking about now is this allows us to do what we call a paradigm shift. Talk about an ocean economy, okay? And really I think the pivotal moment came in COP25. And we have Patricia Morales here from Chile, and I have to pay tribute to Chile here because Chile had the presidency of the COP25, and I believe they're the ones who basically said, listen, the ocean is not a victim. The ocean can be a key factor in mitigating climate change. That happened last year in Madrid at the COP25. To me, this is a watershed event, what we call a pivotal moment. So now we know, we have the science. The science tells us the lungs of the planet are in the ocean. We have an example of the whales, and the whales are a natural-based solution to climate change. The question is, how do we go from that science, from those numbers that I gave you, to actually talking about an economy around that science? How do we make it? How do we bring it to life? Well, first of all, we needed to translate the science in terms of financial terms. Why? Because people forget that the decision makers are not in the world of science. The decision makers are government bodies, or budget people, or very rich people that have the resources but somehow have been kept out of this conversation for whatever reason. So we need to translate, and that's how I see the work that I've done with my colleagues, is to basically translate what the scientists already knew into a language that allows us to bring together the minds and the resources of others to kind of solve this problem, which is how to create a vibrant ocean economy. So by translating the science into financial benefit, we can engage policymakers, we can then engage financial markets, and that's all by putting a value on the services that the ecosystem value. Okay, I'm only focusing on the services for which we can actually measure, because the whale is far more valuable than any number I can put on it, because it's life itself, and life is priceless. So we're just focusing on the services that the whale provides to us, services that are of tremendous value to us. So what we did is, when we said, okay, so the whale captures carbon, well, there's a market for carbon, there's a price for carbon. The whale also helped tourism. We have the ticket price for tourism. And the whale also helped increase the fishes, and we have the value for the fishing industry. So what would be whales worth in dollar terms in today's money? And I can tell you that this is a minimum. This is not an upper bound. A minimum, a whale on average is worth $2 million. Now, why is that important? Because you have to remember, in some countries where they still eat whale meat, the value of a dead whale is between $40,000 and $80,000 if it's a fin whale. So imagine, what I'm trying to tell you is that a living whale is far more valuable to us than a dead whale. Okay, so the value of life in real terms, in monetary terms, is far more valuable than seeing a dead whale, being served at a restaurant that for a few bucks. Okay, but in order for finance to have a bite, to kind of move forward, to kind of create an economy around what we know, we need policy. Policy is very important, because policy provides the framework through which the finance can actually survive. Okay, so what we need first is to agree that let's take the whale for example. We need to agree what are the legal rights of whales. There's an example that comes out of New Zealand, where basically New Zealand has conferred personhood on rivers. Imagine, a river in New Zealand now has the rights and obligations of a human being. And in fact, New Zealand quite recently declared that all animals are sentient beings. Sentient beings, okay, meaning they have feelings, they think, they have thought, okay? And by the way, this is not a new idea. This was an old idea that humans actually knew up until the 16th century. Okay, and we somehow forgot about it, and now we're just coming back full circle to what we used to know before. So you start with the legal rights. Okay, so let's say in the case of whale, we say the whales are a public good. Okay, next thing is, well, there's these guys have valued the whale at $2 million. So if any harm is done to the whale, the penalty is $2 million. Okay, that once you have the legal rights, once you have the monitoring and the enforcement, that starts the game moving, because then every other stakeholder starts to take this idea seriously. And of course, we don't build markets on penalties, we build markets on incentives. We want people to feel good about partaking in a market, not to work off of fear, but have this positive feeling about being part of something. Okay? So once we have the legal, once we have the legal side, once we have the pricing side, then we can talk about ocean as a renewable resource. Okay? Meaning keeping things in the ocean are far more valuable than taking things out of the ocean. That's what Sylvia and Rym were talking about. The extractive view of the ocean has been devastating for us. Okay, I can also talk about land. The extractive view of land has been devastating to us. So in order to create this sort of ocean economy, we need to establish the legal rights, the protection, and then we do the valuation of the natural services. That brings in the private sector. Because once the private sector understands, for example, in the case of a whale, here's a whale, it's protected. If you were to injure it or to harm it, there's a penalty, it's being monitored. Then the private sector is very, very innovative, thinks, well, maybe we can come into this. Maybe we can create a markets around a living whale. Okay? I can give you many examples, maybe in the Q&A, of how this thing would come about. Anyway, what this is going to do is allow for a public-private partnership. And of course, for any conservation effort to be sustainable, you need to have the ownership by the local communities, because they're the ones who have to see the benefit of it. Well, when you create markets around the living nature, in the case of the whale, then of course the local communities around it see that there's value from this whale. And of course, that value is going to translate to them in terms of income, in terms of employment, in terms of opportunities. So now you have the private sector working with the public sector, working with the local communities. The NGOs can come in and provide the know-how, and the IFIs can come in and shore up, whatever residual risk that these economies cannot provide for themselves, in order to motivate more investment into the ocean economy. Okay, so what I'm describing to you is something we can really do. I call it the win-win model. There are no losers in this economy. Everybody is a winner. All stakeholders are winners, because it comes on the realization of my first statement, which is the sustainability of our economic system depends on the sustainability of our ecosystem. And if you really want a case that is case in point, as we say, proof of concept, is just think about what happened in the case of COVID. Here's a virus that you can't even see in a local wet market that you and I would probably never visit, brought the whole world to a standstill. Okay, so and COVID is just one example of nature looking, pushing back at the humans and saying, remember that you are part of the natural world. You need to work with me. You should not be working against me, because it's only going to boomerang back to you. So the model that I'm describing is a partnership with nature, be it blue, be it green, it doesn't really matter. Earth takes one breath, and we are all part of that breath. Only then, when we have that economic system in place, and I call it this the economics of tomorrow, Okay, then you can really meaningfully talk about economic growth that is sustainable, that is inclusive, and by definition is nature friendly. Okay, so let me stop here, and so that hopefully I generate enough questions and that we can have a discussion among the panelists.
Thank you very much, Ralph. This is a very clear presentation. Of course, I am very aware of the research you are doing and you've been doing for the past years on the same. And I think what you are proposing really is a breakthrough in a way, but at the same time, it has to be very carefully regulated, because if you increase value, the dollars will become even bigger. And then many people would be interested to go and fish more because the value increases. And this is not what we would like to do, especially in countries where the legal frameworks are not developed. And I think it is extremely important to, first of all, develop the institutions and the legal frameworks to allow this framework to work specifically in countries in the Mediterranean and Africa. And I always go back to the case of Mozambique, where the financial market from Europe funded more than $700 million to fish tuna in the Mozambique coast. And they didn't do it. They took the money and there is no tuna and there is no fish and there is anything. So in reality, it's good for the tuna because it stays in the sea, which is, I think it's much better like that. But then if you increase the value, then obviously the loans for this type of purposes will increase. And then if it is not carefully regulated, then there is a big issue. But we can debate this later on to see how we can develop a regulated market. And I am not a fan, I would say, of regulated market in nature. I think we need to have it protected and to preserve diversity and to biodiversity. But then in case we need it, because what Sylvia said, we need to set the limits. And those are the limits that we need to define. And I think this is extremely important. Now, I would like to move to my colleagues. Are we ready to play the movie? Because I still like that movie and I would like to play it because it's really very clear how the value and the contribution of the whales to tackle climate change. And I think it is important to accelerate this type of research, to accelerate the green transition using nature-based solutions. And I believe this is the first step, but then it has to be accelerated to reach the Paris target. So Kinga, are you managing the yes, okay. She's telling me the Dropbox is synchronizing, so we're not going to be synchronizing for much longer. So listen, let the Dropbox synchronizing, and I would like to move to
the world.
Oh, yes, finally, okay, great.
This is a humpback whale, one of the world's largest animals. It can grow up to 18 meters long and weigh up to 40 tons. Recently, however, the humpback whale gained a new feature, a price tag. It is now worth $2 million. But why? Because big whales can help humanity in the fight against climate change. It's an ecosystem service that could be worth millions of dollars per whale, according to new analysis by economists, who asked the question, how much is a whale worth? It's an exceptional way of saving our climate. But how can whales be valued in dollars? And how can these marine mammals have an effect on our climate? Let's put this under the microscope. Whales combat carbon naturally. Big whales like filter-feeding baleen and sperm whales help sequester carbon. They hoard it in their bodies, stockpiling tons of carbon apiece, like giant swimming trees. We all know that trees are effective carbon tanks. A mature tree absorbs up to 22 kilos of carbon dioxide each year. But next to these marine giants, there's no comparison. A single whale with an average lifespan of 60 years stores about 33 tons of carbon dioxide. That means one whale is equivalent to 1,500 trees. When a whale dies, its carcass sinks to the bottom of the sea. The carbon stored in it is taken out of the atmospheric cycle for hundreds or even thousands of years. But whales do even more to fight climate change. They provide a special eco-service called the whale pump. In the depths of the ocean, whales feed on tiny marine organisms like plankton and krill. Then they return to the surface where they release huge fecal plumes, floating masses of pee and poo rich in iron, phosphorus, and nitrogen, exactly the substances plankton needs to grow. And more plankton is just what the planet needs. Plankton captures an estimated 40% of all the CO2 produced worldwide, and it contributes at least 50% of the oxygen in our atmosphere. It would take 4 Amazon rainforests to capture the equivalent amount of CO2. In recent years, scientists have discovered that plankton is blooming along the migratory routes of whales. Traveling between their breeding and feeding grounds, whales excrete nutrition into oceans all over the world, iron into cold waters, and nitrogen and phosphorus into warm seas. So the more whales there are, the more plankton there is, and the more carbon can be absorbed. That's great geoengineering. But what about the price tag? How can these whale characteristics be converted into dollars and cents? That's where a nature-loving economist steps in. He wanted to drive home how important whales are, so he put it in terms people could understand: money. He took the per-ton price of carbon and multiplied it by the quantity that a single great whale could store in its body. The result? Each whale weighed out to an average of $2 million. This was a surprise even to the expert himself, Ralph Chami.
The 2 million came out, and
I think this is also very important to understand the science behind this pricing that you did, and this is the breakthrough that we discussed it several times together, and also you applied a very low price for the carbon. I think we discussed it, so we could even go beyond the 2 million if we apply the real price of tons of CO2 emitted, and I think it's more than $70, and everybody knows, but you applied the market price, which is $24.4 or 0.7, I don't remember. But anyhow, I think this is it's for me the beginning of rethinking our species value, and also all the natural resources that we have from this point of view. Their contribution to tackle the climate change and to accelerate the green transition toward the Paris Agreement target. So I would like to move now to the legal perspective. I'm very pleased to have Yara Saab. Yara, she's the coordinator of operations of the Regional Activity Center for Sustainable Consumption and Production. This is the heart of the question, really, to move into sustainable production and consumption of the Barcelona Convention Mediterranean Action Plan. And I'm very happy to have also Yara based in Barcelona soon. She was in Beirut, and I hope everything is fine with your family in Beirut after the explosion. Yara, she's an international law expert. She held several positions, such as legal advisor of the permanent mission of Lebanon to the United Nations in New York, but also a legal officer at the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. So she has very much also a knowledge on the law of the sea, and also consultant on development issues at the UN Economic and Social Commission of Western Asia. So Yara, the floor is yours to give us your perspective from a legal point of view. Yara, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rym. I hope everyone can hear me. Good afternoon, first of all, dear fellow panelists and to members of the audience. I wish to first of all warmly thank Professor Ayadi for her kind invitation for me to participate in this afternoon's important and timely discussion. I must admit that when Rym mentioned to me today's topic, it was somewhat daunting. Climate change, biodiversity, the blue economy, bioeconomics in 10 minutes, which are all each a world in their own right. The applicable legal regimes are also extremely intricate and complex, and they require an analysis at different levels, the international, the regional, and the national levels. So we'll try to contribute to this discussion by setting out broadly the state of play in the global and the Mediterranean contexts in terms of the political will of member states to tackle climate change and the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, and how that all ties into the concepts of blue economy and bioeconomy, which we know are more of policy topics rather than strictly legal terms. In this regard, I will intervene on the basis of the definition according to which the blue bioeconomy includes the non-traditionally exploited groups of marine organisms and their commercial application. These organisms comprise seaweed, so macroalgae, microorganisms, and invertebrates. Traditionally speaking, the blue bioeconomy in this sense does not include fisheries or aquaculture from perhaps a legal perspective, but of course we can address these issues during the Q&A session. Lastly, since we are here today also to mark the launching of EMEA's new research initiative on bioeconomics and its integration into the Mediterranean blue economy policies, I will conclude by making a few recommendations, if you would allow me, on the way forward for this upcoming work. Have received much attention in the last few years, especially since the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals. They are, of course, not new. States have been entering into international agreements on climate change on the one hand and on marine biodiversity on the other for around 3 decades now. I know it's a bit incredible to think that in 2020 we are still struggling with these issues, taking into account that it has been so far quite a long journey. So as we all know, the main framework for climate change is the 1992 UNFCCC, which has near universal membership, followed by the subsequent Kyoto Protocol, and of course the 2015 Paris Agreement, which was mentioned earlier on, which of course aims, all of these 3 instruments together, they aim at stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that will prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system in a time frame that would allow ecosystems to adapt naturally. Let us recall that the Paris Agreement's central aim is to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change by keeping global temperature rise this century well below the 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit that temperature increase even further to 1.5. So increasingly, one would think that since oceans and seas are the main ecosystems affected by climate change, as Sylvia and Prof put it so well, and that they in turn also play an essential role in climate stabilization as they act as carbon sinks, the UNFCCC regime would make a strong reference and identify linkages with legal instruments on oceans and seas, and that it would establish certain legal responsibilities for contracting parties to mitigate the effects of climate change on the marine environment. Strangely enough, the climate change and marine environment legal regimes have always been designed as 2 completely separate bubbles. In fact, the Paris Agreements referenced only in 2015 for the first time the oceans in its preamble. So those of us in the field of the law of the sea were quite surprised by the continuing absence of reference to oceans and seas, even in that latest instrument. In the meanwhile, however, in parallel, at the same forum in Paris, the initiative called Because the Ocean was launched. Since then, important diplomatic work has been deployed so that at the last COP25 in Madrid, which was co-hosted also by Chile, as mentioned by Ralph, closer links between the health of the climate and the health of the ocean were finally established. One of those active actors, of course, at COP25 was Fundación MERI, so I'm looking forward also to hear Patricia's views on the topic. We need to keep an eye out on developments during the current year, of course, and at the next COP in Glasgow, which promises to also be a continuation of a blue COP. So here at least we see that at the legal scene there is quite a lot of development in trying to integrate questions of marine health with climate change international legal standards. So now that I have commented the international legal regime on climate change, I will quickly move over to instruments relating to biodiversity in the marine environment. Of course, the main applicable text is the Convention on Biodiversity, the CBD, the objectives of which are threefold. So the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of its components, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from genetic resources. This last objective is further defined in the Nagoya Protocol, and it applies within the jurisdiction of contracting parties. So this leaves us with a major gap. What happens with biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, so on the high seas and in the deep sea bed called the common heritage of mankind? So for this purpose, a groundbreaking decision was adopted in 2017. To my taste, it should have received much more public attention, as important it was as the Paris Agreement. But unfortunately, that is not the case. However, we are looking forward to more developments in that sense that would be able to engage more civil society and the public as a whole. So after launching the process called BBNJ, it's Biodiversity Beyond Areas of National Jurisdiction, in 2004, an international conference on an international legal binding instrument under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is the constitution of the oceans, on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction was convened by the GA of the United Nations. Since then, the process is ongoing, and the international community is expected within the next few years to adopt a text addressing four main elements: marine genetic resources, including questions of the sharing of benefits, measures such as area-based management tools, which could include marine protected areas, environmental impact assessments, and capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. Now, having set out the international regime, I'd move to the Mediterranean context. So at the regional level, of course, the reference point is the 1995 Barcelona Convention for the protection of the marine environment and the coastal region in the Mediterranean, as well as its 7 protocols. So according to the Barcelona Convention, the contracting parties have an obligation, be it individually or jointly, as in through cooperation, to take all appropriate measures to protect and preserve biological diversity in the Mediterranean. The most relevant protocol to our discussion is the Specially Protected Areas Biodiversity Protocol. It is of great interest to note that by expressly providing for the possibility of establishing specially protected areas of Mediterranean interest in areas beyond national jurisdiction in the Mediterranean, the Barcelona Convention and its protocol is a pioneer among regional seas programs, as it goes a step further from the actual international legal regime. Nevertheless, unfortunately for the time being, only 9% of the surface of the Mediterranean Sea is under a legal designation or a protected status. So I will end here the overview of the different legal regimes and perhaps say a few words on the blue economy. So the first matter I think that should be addressed relates, of course, to questions on definitions. At the European level, the EU's blue economy encompasses all sectoral and cross-sectoral economic activities based on or related to the oceans, to the seas, and to the coast, without reference to their sustainability. On the other hand, as I'm sure my colleague Alessandra will explain, at the level of the UFM, the ministers of the Union for the Mediterranean in 2015 recognized the importance of the blue economy. However, they did add the element of sustainable development in their understanding of the blue economy. So this is an issue, I think, that from a legal perspective can bring about an interesting debate at the policy level. Additionally, in December 2019, at Naples, the ministers of the contracting parties to the Barcelona Convention considered that the resources of the Mediterranean should trigger economic prosperity and that they should contribute to the stability of the region with green jobs and innovation opportunities for the maritime economy sectors, be they traditional or emerging. So that, of course, would include bioeconomy and biotechnology, which is one of the questions that are addressed today. So this indicates that contracting parties to the Barcelona Convention are committed to the blue economy, and that paves the way for more policies to be adopted at the regional level to that end. In this regard, my center, the Regional Activity Center for Sustainable Consumption and Production, will contribute to these efforts through the center's flagship project called SwitchMed, which is funded by the European Union, to launch its blue economy component to support Mediterranean countries in making the switch to sustainable consumption and production patterns in the blue economy. So to conclude with reflections on the new research initiative related to bioeconomics and its integration into the blue economy policies, I would like to propose 5 adjectives for it to be holistic, to be multidisciplinary, for it to be exhaustive, for it to be equitable, and to be inclusive. And I'll explain it. So in terms of the holistic aspect, analyzing bioeconomics should be done keeping in mind the ecosystem approach and marine spatial planning, so as not to lose sight of the integration between bioeconomy and the other sectors of the blue economy, be they traditional or emerging. Multidisciplinary, as perfectly mirrored this afternoon in this discussion, it would be wonderful to maintain and reinforce the multidisciplinary approach already demonstrated. It should also be exhaustive in the sense that it should have a clear sight of the existing international and regional instruments to better inform the discussion and identify any possible gaps. It should be equitable, recognizing that there's a massive gap between the capacities of developing and developed states in this field, and to consider how to narrow that gap and ways of providing technical assistance to Mediterranean states from the south to be able to level the playing field and allow international cooperation in the sector. And lastly, it should be inclusive, because while the bioeconomy is traditionally the turf of big industry, we shouldn't lose sight of SMEs and entrepreneurs that have also a very important role to play in the bioeconomy. Lastly, to conclude, we've all been reading since the start of the COVID crisis Winston Churchill's quote, to never let a good crisis go to waste, inflicted by COVID. It is the fact that green and blue growth have now been propelled at the forefront of the international agenda to build back better. So let's make the most of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yara, for this very comprehensive expose. I think this is very clear to us that we will move with the different disciplines, because economics alone cannot solve the problems. It's clear, because we need to have other scientists and legal experts and policy experts who will really drive also this new research. But also in terms of the inclusiveness, I absolutely agree with you. And we, for example, are starting a couple of projects on the blue economy from an entrepreneurship point of view, trying really to test certain aspects that we would like to see on the ground. and see if it is feasible or not. So I think sometimes also when we confront to the practice, it becomes a little bit more difficult. So we need to really move this thinking much forward. So now let me move to a country that has taken big steps. Yes, Chile had the COP25 last year, and I had the chance and the honor to be part of the panels talking about how finance can contribute in the green transition and so on, not the blue, because we didn't talk about blue transitions back then. So I would like to introduce Patricia Morales. Patricia is the CEO of the Foundation Mary, Filantropía Cortés Solari, based in Santiago de Chile. The foundation mission is to protect nature reserves in the region and to strengthen research and education for the conservation and sustainable management of the freshwater marine cultural heritage in the North Patagonia. And Patricia, she has been really leading the operations in the foundation. Thank you very much for joining us, Patricia, and we would like to hear, in fact, your Blue Boat initiative, which is really very important for your region, and which could inspire a region like the Mediterranean Sea. So please, Patricia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rym, for the floor. It's a pleasure and honor to be here with you, with obviously Sylvia, Yara, Alessandra, and Ralph, with whom we work a lot. So I'm going to share, first of all, my PC. Okay, can you see? Is it fine like that?
Yes, on the view mode, please. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to talk today about the role of the oceans in a sustainable development society, and talking, obviously, introduce you to the Blue Boat initiative, one of our main projects about that. But first of all, I would like to talk a little bit about the marine ecosystem services and how or why those marine ecosystem services are the kind of blind spot of the economy and sustainability. Then I'm going to introduce very briefly Mary Foundation and to present the Blue Boat initiative. So Ralph talked about that already, but we all know that oceans are very essential for our ecosystem. They represent 17% of the animal protein that support our food security. We already know here that they regulate our climate. They produce half the oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere, and they absorb around 26 and 30% of anthropogenic carbon dioxide emission into the atmosphere. So at the end of the day, economists usually said that oceans are essential for the GDP because they represent around 61% of the world total GDP. The thing is that data doesn't consider the economical value of the marine ecosystem services, and this is what we are talking about today. Okay, so obviously the green economy is defined as one that results in improved human well-being and social equity while significantly reducing environmental risk and ecological scarcity. And the problem is that usually the environmental sacrifice zones are made to compete with employment and the subsequent contribution to the GDP. I used to work for 6 years in politics, and usually policymaker has always this misunderstood because they consider the climate change and environment issue as something that compete with health, with education, and with the other carpet of the government. And maybe this discussion is misguided. So this is why we really need the economic evaluation of the marine ecosystem services, because without any kind of economic database that produce this valuation, there is no way to measure the real impact of the damage of those ecosystem damage in the GDP. So what we really believe from Mary Foundation and from Filantropía Cortés Solari is that the economic valuation of the ocean must include, we all know, the ocean like a raw material because of the agricultural and fishing sector, and this is a reality and we have to face that. But it's crucial to consider the economical valuation of the marine ecosystem services. And this is why the paper and the study that did Ralph Chami with Sonia Espanyol, who is our main leader in the ocean area and Marine Foundation, with other economists of the university, are so important. Actually, they value the whales ecosystem services in North Patagonia at $4 million by whale. And this is something really important according of what we are talking today, because when we put a price on this service, we can try to develop a regulation. In Chile, if you have a price on these services, you can say, okay, if something happened to any whales, for example, from this moment, this precise moment, you can put a price to the person who did this damage. And obviously this changed all the whole conversation. Okay, so we all know what the IPCC tell us about the increase of the carbon concentration in the atmosphere, about the acidification of the oceans. So the thing is that we are facing this huge emergency, and it is not only an emergency in the environmental dimension, but also in the social, cultural, and economical one. And this is maybe one of the most important conclusions for us from Marine Foundation. We really need to work in the all dimension, because most of the effect on climate change will persist even if emissions are stopped or reduced, okay? So the first economical analysis for that was the Stern Review in 2006, commissioned by the UK government, who told us that if the world doesn't invest 1% of the global GDP to mitigate the effect of climate change, the world would face an economical recession of 20% of the global GDP. So this is happening now. We really have to promote the dialogue between the financial world and the environment. And this is what we are trying to do from philanthropy with another project, actually. This is beyond of the scope of this presentation, and we are working with Ralph also in this project. But we really need to promote that. It's not only a matter of environment, it's not only a matter of science or economic, but really need to face all the dimensions together, okay? So answer must be multidimensional. We need to promote projects like Blue Body Initiative, I'm going to explain it, in the environmental dimension, but also include the economical aspect, social one, and cultural one, working with communities in order to change behaviors, help people that have a lot of impact because of the climate change, and so on. So who we are from Marine Foundation. Marine Foundation belongs to Philanthropia Cortes Solaris. We are a philanthropist project that is 18 years old. We try to promote an integral and sustainable development in Chile and in the world through science, education, and conservation. Francisca Cortes Solaris is our executive president of Marine Foundation and Philanthropia Cortes Solaris. It's really important for us to try to promote the fact that people that has a big patrimony, but also community scientists, everyone has to really put all his energy on the climate change, because there is an urgency and we really need to face that. So Mary, as I told you, do scientific research and environmental education for the conservation of terrestrial and marine ecosystem services in Chile and the world. In Chile, we work in three main territories: in the very north, in Atacama Desert, around Santiago, and in the south of Chile, in our Patagonia. You have to think and believe that Chile is like, and imagine like Chile is like this country that started in Norway and finished in Chad. So we are a very long country. We are this kind of big natural laboratory with all the climate except tropical. This is why it's a very interesting country to find innovative and new solution in order to try to mitigate climate change, okay? And we work in this territory through our two foundations, Caserta Foundation, that do educational programs, and Marine Foundation. So Blue Body Initiative is located, first of all, in its first stage there around Melimoyo Reserve, our third natural park. in the south of Chile, in the north of Patagonia, at the end of Chiloé, the main island of Chile, okay? This project arrived 8 years after start. The line of research about blue whales and whales in general that lead Sonia Español. We start in 2012 study acoustic behaviors of whales, developing a lot of educational program in order to get sensibilize the community and so on. And now we are very pleased to introduce Blue Boat Initiative. This is a national initiative that we do with the private sector, but also mainly with the government in order to protect the whales. Why whales? Well, because of all the reasons that Ralph already explained. Whales are like a pilot. They capture this carbon, and what we want to try to do is, for one hand, protect them, and for the other hand, evaluate the economical value of their ecosystem services. I'm going to introduce you the project with a very brief video.
For millions of years, whales have populated the waters from the Antarctic to the Arctic, sequestering 33 tons of CO2 over their lifetime, 1,500 times more than a tree. Their passage increases marine flora and its diversity, generating plankton, which help to, over their lifetime, 50% of the oxygen consumed by the planet.
I'm not sharing my screen.
Patricia, we're not seeing the movie. We are seeing just one slide.
And there? Now?
For millions of years, whales have populated the waters from the Antarctic to the Arctic, sequestering 33 tons of CO2 over their lifetime, 1,500 times more than a tree. Their passage increases marine flora and its diversity, generating plankton, which help to, over their lifetime, 50% of the oxygen consumed by the planet. However, whales are under threat. Between 2007 and 2019, over 1,200 whales died. This is why the Blue Boat Initiative was born, a project to protect these life-giving mammals. The project seeks to monitor the oceans and generate alternative routes for sustainable maritime traffic in times of environmental crisis, to prevent whales from colliding with ships and cruise ships on their travels. The Blue Boat Initiative will install and connect the first South American network of early warning acoustic buoys for whale protection. A network of intelligent buoys with a complex of system hydrophones, oceanographic sensors and transmitters, which will begin to operate in the interior sea of Chiloé, the Gulf of Corcovado, the Chacao Channel, the Gulf of Ancud, the Guafo Channel, the Tiktok Bay, and many other fjords and channels. The satellite information sent by the buoys will allow the monitoring of maritime traffic areas and warn vessels about the presence of whales, proposing new routes to avoid hitting these valuable cetaceans. This project will also provide vital data on global warming thanks to the nature of these vertebrates. The ocean is an essential part of the cycle of life, and we can help keep it going, multiplying and benefiting the whole world. Be part of this unprecedented Chilean initiative. Help us change the history of the ocean and the world.
So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm not going to repeat this slide because Ralph already showed it, but the thing is that when we start this project, we try to focus on the fact that obviously the whales are a great pilot in order to explain to the society, to the government, to the policymaker, why is it so important to consider the marine ecosystem services because of the capture of carbon, but because of the rest of the functions in the nature, in the ecosystem of the whales. And obviously we can do the same with the whales and other species. So this project has two main areas. The first one is the scientific, let's say the scientific and traffic maritime regulation dimension of the project. we start in the Golfo de Corcovado. This is a pilot. We start there. Then we're going to cover the rest of the country and other countries in the region. We install and connect this first South American early warning network for the protection of whales. And obviously, we want to preserve the whales, but also to try to have more database, scientific database about the ecosystem. And the other hand of the project is the whole part about valuation, economical valuation of the marine ecosystem services. Why is it so important? Because if we really want to change the way to approximate the public policy in climate change, we really need to make economic dialogue with science. And what we want to do is put a price on those ecosystem services. I know that this is a little bit controversial, but as an economist, I really believe that otherwise it's really complicated, because at the end of the day, you see, when you do policymakers, when you discuss with policymaker, and in order to do public policy, you really need to see how much money do you have for 1 year, for the next carbon in health and education and so on. So you really need to explain to the policymaker that climate change, it's not a matter only of science, only of environment, it's really something multidimensional. And this is why I put a price on these services. It means put a price on the damage in case of damage, you see. And you have an alternative cost, as we say, in an economy, and this is really important for us. So this is a graph that shows how this works. We have the buoy, what's hydrophone, oceanographic sensor, and the hydrophone recognize the sound of the whales and then transmit the signal through the satellite to the schist and so on. So just to finish, maybe the most important idea of this presentation is that climate change for us, it's something that we have to face from a multidimensional aspect. We have to take care about the environmental dimension, social dimension, financial dimension, cultural dimension, and all together create a new institutionality. Without that, we're not going to change the world, because actually we have enough evidence, scientific evidence about the importance of the ecosystem services, but it hasn't been enough. We have a lot of community that are organized in Chile at least, but around the world, trying to promote a new regulation in climate change. So we really need that economy has to include in the GDP how intensive is the use in the nature. Maybe it could open a new door in this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for this very good presentation, which in fact gives many new ideas for other regions probably to study and to get inspired with. For the next session, which is also part of the discussion in this panel, I would like to give the floor to Alessandra Sensi. Alessandra, she's the head of Environment and Blue Economy at the Water, Environment and Blue Economy Division of the Union for the Mediterranean. Union for Mediterranean, for those who do not know the organization, it's an action-driven intergovernmental institution based in Barcelona, which is bringing together European Union member states and the 15 countries from the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean to promote dialogue, cooperation in several areas of actions that are predefined. One of them is this blue economy and also water environment. I'm very happy to have Alessandra with us to share with us the action plan and what the Union for Mediterranean is doing on this area, because the Mediterranean Sea is very important for the region, for the people around, and for the societies and communities. And I think the way the Union for the Mediterranean is working is also as a platform to engage academics, civil society organizations, scientists, and others to support the objectives of the Union for the Mediterranean. Alessandra, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Rym, and many thanks, everybody. It has been really extremely interesting to follow the inputs and the discussion, actually, that we receive up to now. And it's really an honor to be here to bring, let's say, all this information into the Mediterranean context. I'd like actually to start in a certain way with a good news, because the Mediterranean region has been engaged actually in green and blue economy already since quite some years. And indeed, it was mentioned also by Yara, it's a pioneer in that respect. And it's really an example for others to follow. Has been able in a certain way already to implement, to absorb, to integrate concepts, but also in a certain way to pilot. And we are in a phase of possible, let's say, upscaling of concept and practices that a wider community has been discussing so far. I refer to the word community because indeed the blue economy community has been developed over the past years. And as you said, Rym, it's not just a great community of, let's say, policymakers, but it's a very lively community made of policymakers, academia, researcher, private sector. So what we'll build actually in terms of blue economy is a positive agenda where many different range of stakeholders want to contribute to. So multi-stakeholders, multi-level, national, local. I would also like to mention that the willingness is indeed not to tackle the economic aspects only. As Yara said, we are referring to sustainable blue economy by default, and we are looking, as the previous speakers also stressed, at this important interaction also between land and sea. We can't split. I mean, even just the plastic problems that we are facing in the Mediterranean do derive mainly by our human beings actually impacts on land. Before I go to a presentation, which is maybe more standard with respect to what we are doing, let me also mention that there have been important concepts that have been referred to. I'd like to mention that we work at different levels, ministerial level, work in dialogues and projects, and we are currently, for I would say even a coincidence of historical events, moving now towards two important ministerial gatherings of the 43 Europe Mediterranean countries, indeed one on environment and climate change and another one on blue economy. Even if in operational terms, of course, they are in a certain way separate, they are also strongly interlinked. And these ideas and this concept, as the one mentioned by Patricia, namely the one of going beyond GDP, and it's something, of course, not new for environmental economists, as for example I am. It's an important, let's say, advancement that we are discussing because it's an engagement. No, it's actually strange in a certain way that despite the convention experience and years that have passed, this is still not there. Even just in environmental accounting, environmental accounting has been referred so far as satellite accounts around, main GDP accounts. So I'd like now to go to my presentation and maybe show you a bit more in detail where we as UFM are heading towards at this precise historical moment. As I said, there are two important processes that we are running, one at ministerial level, but I would like to say it's not just restricted to the ministerial, because as I said, it's a process, and there's been a long process of consultation with countries and stakeholders. So we are just currently, let's say, recompacting all the important inputs that we have received into common agendas that we commonly, countries, organizations, NGOs, private sector, will contribute to implement. One is foreseen actually for December 2020 in Egypt. We hope we will be able actually to run it due to the COVID situation. It might be slightly postponed. And then we have the next one actually in February 2021 planned to be in Malta. As far as the one on environment and climate change is concerned, I would like to say that we had the first ministerial already in 2014, and that ministerial actually was very important in terms of what the Mediterranean region decided to do. I mean, it was a conceptual shift, basically, from pure depollution to pollution prevention linked to climate change. So in a certain way, the region, what has been put in together is already what we currently call the Green Deal. So the Mediterranean region actually was already advancing towards this Green Deal. And we are now working more and more towards this sort of Mediterranean, let's say, Green Deal, as the axes of work are indeed deepening. We have been working on sustainable consumption and production as a main approach to green economy, which is of course now green circular economy. And what we as, for example, Union for the Mediterranean have been doing is also in terms of funding to try to bring again the region together. As you know, the region, of course, suffered political tension, but there is a strong will to work, together, and strong will and a strong need to work together. And of course, the Mediterranean is by default, by definition, the shared common good. So in on projects and activities, for example, like the one on plastic, we have been trying to put together the different pieces of the puzzle and the different type of fundings so that the region can progress as one, not just as European region, not just as North African region, not just as Middle East, but as Mediterranean region all together. As this is, let's say, this webinar is more targeted, let's say, also to economic concept. I just wanted to mention some of the indeed concepts that are articulating the upcoming ministerial, which is indeed the promotion of an indicator of economic growth, as we said, beyond GDP, enabling environment for investments, elimination of subsidies, promotion of eco incentives, and so on. I mean, we are, apart from the conceptual part, if we want to shape the new economy we need, and we need since many years already, there is surely, a fiscal policy aspect that needs to be tackled together with the trade-related aspects that would need to be tackled in order for new economic models, let's say, to be promoted. This is basically the basics, actually, of our language today. So we are moving from this linear economy to this circular economy. Together with the ministerial, we are also promoting, of course, an agenda for implementation, which main axes are the ones you see, of course, green circular economy. Another one on pollution reduction and prevention, mostly prevention. I mean, it's clear by now that it's not a matter of reducing, but it's a matter of preventing pollution that we, of course, as human being through our human activities generate, but also to protect and preserve the natural resources. I'd like also to put attention that on the climate component, these are the axes of work that can be used so far: science policy interface, cooperation on NDCs, and climate finance. And that currently, and this was actually a call that we had already in the previous ministerial declaration, that vulnerability assessment for the Mediterranean be made. So on the example of the IPCC, a sort of IPCC report has been produced for the Mediterranean, putting together the available data and showing that, of course, I mean, the Mediterranean is an hotspot for climate change. We're talking also, of a potential raise of temperature up to 6 degrees, with, of course, devastating impacts. And this report is currently being discussed for policy-making purposes, meaning that the extract of the science that is there should be turned actually into concrete actions to come. And again, what was already mentioned is that, of course, our corrupted in a certain way relation with nature came out, of course, during the COVID crisis. So all these elements are being absorbed also for future action. And it's no surprise that this call from the planet has come. There was already this tension. We, working especially in this area, we knew there would have been a moment of sort of no return, and this is, of course, an important call to see what we still can recover. I mean, there was this, inspiring word from Sylvia at the beginning, saying we can revert the trend. I hope we can revert the trend. It's at least 30 years that there is this call for a change. And despite, let's say, the efforts, we still need to progress. Of course, there is a problem of pace. Basically, process takes much longer than to take place than, let's say, the urgency of the situation where we are. So there has to be, obviously, a concentration of efforts. About the Sustainable Blue Economy Agenda, I want to mention that there is a beautiful sentence, I think that was already there when it was launched in 2015. And again, this is a sentence by the 43 countries saying that clean and healthy seas are drivers and enablers for national and regional economies. This was the premise this morning. Without this core concept, the declaration wouldn't be there. And it's actually what the countries are currently working on. I could speak for hours and hours of all the different sub and regional activities that we are carrying out. I have, let's say, in a certain way put together a bit of a broader presentation that I'll be pleased actually to circulate, and the organizers already have. I just wanted to focus, as we talked of bioeconomy, of an initiative, which is BlueMed. It's actually sponsored by DG Research at the European Commission. It was originally a European initiative. Now it's a Euro-Mediterranean initiative, in the sense that the Euro-Mediterranean countries have put together a research agenda on which they are working. And basically, this was all originated from a bioeconomy, let's say, report that they have been working on together. So by, let's say, clicking on the site and the website, and that's why I left it there, you can access all the related information. I'll just conclude very rapidly to say, of course, the ministerial I mentioned is going to be in February. We did an online consultation, and these are the priority themes that are being looked at. Again, I do not repeat the word sustainable blue economy, because for us it's given for granted. There wouldn't be a ministerial on blue economy that wouldn't be sustainable. So all the engagement, and this is especially interesting, let's say, group, the one on blue economy, because it's multidisciplinary. So we don't have just indeed at the level, more institutional level, ministries of environment, but we also have Ministry of Economics, Ministry of Transport, Ministry of Fishery and Aquaculture, planning, and so on. So this helps really to discuss and see the different, let's say, implication for every sector and how we can work together. I saw one of the questions, and I'll conclude with that. On maritime spatial planning. Indeed, I mean, this is one of the key governance tools that are being put in place together also with integrated coastal zone management. Remain available for any further, let's say, information or discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Alessandra, for your comprehensive collection of all the activities that the Union for Mediterranean is doing. Now I would like to move for the next few, actually 20 minutes we have in the discussion. I see that in the Q&A session, the Q&A box, we have a few questions, but I have one question to Sylvia. So, and also this is linked to a question that Yara did in the chat box, linked to the fact that science should, in theory, influence policy and legal framework, especially when it's well evidenced. But then science has really struggled a lot to move policy into the right direction, I would say. So since you are in the US, also, how can we try to get or to convince the US to commit to the Paris target and really get, them sensible to this whole thinking of biodiversity and rethinking in a way? And this is also a question I had at the beginning. Because since the 80s, we were following the post-Washington consensus. So only extraction for production and for consumption. So it's a consumer-based model, overproduction and so on. So how can we revert all of this into more, I would say, responsible and more sustainable economic model? Of course, we need to have the US linked to all this dynamic, because Europe has moved a lot. I mean, we're moving into really green economy with the Green Deal, and this has been really the commitment of the European Union, which in fact is leading all this debate, environmental debate so far. Sylvia, please. The micro, please, Sylvia.
What keeps me optimistic is the reality that truth will out in the end. We can defy the laws of nature, but in the end, the laws of nature rule. We can govern ourselves, and we can, if we understand big ideas such as the carbon cycle, we can modify our behavior, but we cannot modify the laws of nature. The sooner we come to grips with the reality that we are really governing ourselves. One example, we try to manage fish. Good luck with that. We need to manage ourselves. We need to look at the value of life beyond just the way we currently account for biodiversity, for example. Or let's just again think about fish. Fish have an accounting base of 0. We think of them as worthless until we kill them. Used to be that way with whales. Whales were free. Now fish are free. It costs something to go catch them, but we don't account for the loss when we take them out of the ocean. I would like to see you, Ralph, perhaps apply the same kind of thinking that you have creatively given to the value of our fellow mammals, the whales in the sea, to take on other forms of life. How about bluefin tuna? We know a value, and it's a high value when they're dead. What about the living value of a bluefin tuna? The carbon value. Like whales, they give back. Here's the thing, that if we can start at any point in your life, it helps if you begin when you're a child, because then it becomes a part of your whole life. But we don't have time to wait for the 10-year-olds of today to become the decision makers. In the next 10 years, we will lose the opportunity that is now available to us to incorporate what we really know to be true. Look at the laws of nature, respect them, to understand that it took 4.5 billion years to change a planet that was rocks and water, non-living, into a system now that is bursting with life, that makes our lives possible. It has only taken us about 4.5 decades to unravel, to seriously disrupt the systems that keep us alive. We can see the evidence. Taking more than 100 million tons of ocean wildlife out of the sea every year. It's more like 150 million tons, but disrupting the system by extracting so much so fast that we have broken the carbon cycle. Using whales as a model is great. People get it. We care about whales. We look at fish and we think of them as something to eat, and people will eat fish one way or the other. But taking so much that we justify based on food security, we need to rethink that model. It's food choice. Of course we have to eat something. We need to eat lower on the food chain. We need to look at how do we achieve food security while achieving security for wildlife in the ocean. The value of fish alive has to be countered by the value of fish dead. It's not just fish, it's squid, it's shrimp, it's krill. Now the new focus on the deep scattering layer, this layer of life that feeds the whales, that feeds the tuna, that feeds the birds, that feeds so many creatures, that has been, until right about now, hidden from view, and we haven't begun to extract this deep scattering layer of life that migrates vertically in the ocean from a depth of about 1,000 meters up to close to the surface on a daily basis. Now, countries are beginning to use fine mesh nets to extract this layer of life from the high seas and from the exclusive economic zones of countries as well, doing further damage to the carbon cycle. When are we going to wake up to realize the value of the living systems, land and sea, that are fundamental to our existence, instead of just thinking them as commodities? Think of them as what keeps us alive. I wish I had a straight answer to your straight question about how do we get science, how do we respect the laws of nature at the highest levels of governance of humankind. I say whatever technique we have, the films, the conferences such as this, but I really ask all of you the same question. How do we break out of this talking to ourselves, we who understand what the issues are, and take it to another level? Take it to, make it a sense as urgent as the other issues that now command our attention. Of course, we're in the throes of a pandemic. We haven't respected the laws of nature. We've known, those of us who are involved in understanding or looking at the natural world and where we fit in, the pandemic of the sort that we're now experiencing has been inevitable, predicted. But it came as a surprise to some of the people who were caught unawares. The climate issues as it relates to blue carbon, green carbon, the living systems, the subject of this conference. The evidence is there. How do we get that knowledge into where it needs to be in terms of governing our behavior, to respect the natural world, to respect the life in the ocean for more than just commodities? It's life itself that's on the line.
Thank you. That's very clear, Sylvia. I think also we need to prioritize, because for sure, we are talking about countries in the Mediterranean and Africa that sometimes use the sea for their livelihood. And with poverty and increasing inequality, I wonder, yeah, if there is a choice.
Well, let's just look at it, because either we will protect what remains of, we'll use, for example, the tuna while we still have tuna, or we will take them all. And then you don't have a choice. In the Pacific, the level of bluefin tuna, for example, is less than 3% of what it was in 1970. We know how to kill them. Can we look at other values, whatever that might be? We've made the transition with whales. Go back 50 years ago, people would think that was impossible. It's not impossible. We have to be more creative about using wildlife as money. Elephants are valued for their tusks, not for their living selves. You can balance a value of a living elephant against the value of their tusks, the value of a shark against the value of their fins. We can take all the sharks. We've taken 90% of them, of the big ones anyway, already. Either we change now while we still have sharks and we still have tuna, we still have squid, we still have krill, or we will lose the chance. And on the way, we are damaging the very underpinnings of the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the oxygen cycle, the whole living fabric of life. We know better, and I take to heart the question. There are people who have their economy, their livelihoods, not their sustenance, their livelihoods based on killing tuna, killing squid, of taking ocean wildlife. But can we creatively think about other ways to make a living so that we can have a living planet?
Yeah, I agree with you. So let me go to Ralph and ask him, do you think market is the solution in valuing biodiversity? And especially when you look at countries in our region, Mediterranean and Africa, where there are other on the agenda, while at the same time the institutional infrastructure, I would call it, is not functioning?
I may, just to pivot off of what Sylvia beautifully put together, the argument has always been on conservation, is that either you're a bleeding heart and believe in conservation, or you're the one who's living in where you are, Rym, in Barcelona, in an apartment, or you could be in Manhattan, or you could be in Nebraska, and you don't see the ocean, you don't really care, because, well, you know, somebody says, do you care about the whales? Yeah, but I also care about bonobos and the cheetahs and the elephants, and so this has been the argument. What we try to do in this body of work that we've created is to say, even if you don't care about the whales themselves, you should care about what they're doing for you.
Yeah.
What we valued is their services to us. I did not value the intrinsic value. There's no way you could value the intrinsic beauty of a whale, of any creature for that matter. We had a focus in mind, is to say that nature, a living nature, a regenerative nature, is far more valuable to us in today's money. We calculated, I didn't get into the nitty-gritty calculations, but what we did, we calculated the present value of all the future benefits. So let me put it differently. What was missing from this whole conversation was the cost of conservation was very well understood. If you tell people we need to protect the tuna, or if you tell people in Chile we need to protect the ocean, or what Yara was talking about, or Alessandra, people understand the cost of all of that because that's in dollar amount or euro amount. But what was missing was the benefit side. The benefit side was residing in the realm of science. people like Sylvia knew all about this. When I started working on the whale, I didn't create the science. I used the science that was already there. The problem is that the policymakers, the people with the money, do not understand the language of science. So it's a matter of translation, of taking the benefits that resided in the world of science, converting into dollars and cents. And now what you do is you present to the policymaker what they do best, which is cost benefit analysis, dollars and dollars. As my mom used to say, apples and apples, oranges and oranges. You say, here's the cost of mitigation, here's the cost of conservation. For example, how much does it cost us to protect the tuna or to protect the sharks? Okay, the Pew Foundation is involved in Palau. Palau has 82% of its ocean, or 87% of its ocean marine protected area, right? And in it, why? Because they make a living from the sharks. The shark is a big industry for Palau. All right, they valued the shark as, I think it's like $1.5 million. Now, the rest of it is left for the boats that hunt for tuna. Okay, so let's take a concrete example. All right, so you have a marine protected area. And why? It's designated because they want to protect their ocean and they have the sharks there. So now there's a tuna ship that comes along looking for tuna. It looks down, the captain looks down and sees 1 tuna and 10 sharks. So what does he do? He drops the net. He grabs the tuna, and the sharks are called collateral catch. Why? Because by killing the sharks that are valuable to the economy of Palau, he does not pay a price. There is no law that says if you were to catch those sharks, if for each shark you're going to pay the value of it live, because they valued it. They valued the living shark for Palau to be about 1.25 million or 1.5 million. So we can change people's behavior. If you were to say next time around, a law is passed, if you were to catch a shark, collateral or no collateral by accident, you are to pay a penalty of 1.5 million, the value of the shark. What would happen is that captain, that ship, when he sees now 1 tuna and 10 sharks, going to think twice about what if I were to catch those sharks by mistake, I'm going to have to pay the penalty. But that's just the beginning. Because what will happen next is the following. Lloyd's of London shows up as an example. Insurance company shows up, okay, and tells the owner of the tanker or the ship, I will insure you against you hitting a shark by mistake or catching a shark by mistake. Because the probability of you catching a shark is probably low enough for us to insure you. What you're really doing is, I'm showing you an example of how the private sector can come into this around the protection of life. Around the protection, we can create markets to protect life. We just have, it's called the paradigm, a shift in the way we think, and it's within our reach. We can do this. So you tell me now, there are poor countries that made their livelihood is because they don't even know what they have in their ocean. How many people in Africa, in the countries, the coastal countries, that know, for example, what's in their ocean? I'm working on the elephants. Sylvia mentioned the elephant. We're working with Fabi Berzaghi and his team. We just valued the elephant in the forests of Africa. One elephant is worth $1.7 million. You know why? Because those elephants in the forests of Africa, these are not the savanna elephants that you see that we go visit, okay? These are the ones you don't see. You know what they do? They help trees sequester carbon. This is science. So you want to help? Let's pour money into the science.
Yeah.
Where the scientists discover the mysteries of this.
Saying that, Ralph, what you're saying is the private sector has to put more money into science. I mean, there is one question there. What would be the role of the private sector? But beyond this also.
They make money because the private sector, by coming into, you're creating markets, but not markets now are around extractive services. No, it's about investing in the ocean, investing in nature. You can create markets. This is not a figment of an imagination. This is real. Dollars and cents.
So what about, for example, the role of the blockchain? So we know that now the blockchain technology has created more transparency and so on. It is at its embryonic, I would say, development. But could we imagine solutions like this for to ensure, for example, carbon neutrality, and trying really to develop such a concept, like, for example, what is happening in the circular economy in other sectors, like, for example, in recycling plastic and all of this? So do you see a solution for that?
Absolutely. I mean, all you need again is take what's happening in Chile. You have the Blue Boat Initiative. It's a collaboration of foundations with scientists, with the government. Mm-hmm. Once you have those actors working together, working around the policy framework, working around the monitoring side, working around the incentive side, the private sector will come in. I mean, Patricia's talking about the buoys. This is who created those acoustics. This is the private sector. The private sector is saying, I can make money from protecting those whales, you see. But what you need is the other side, which you need the policy that says the whales are a public good. The government appoints itself a protector on behalf of the whales. If you hit a whale, it's going to cost you $2 million. Private sector comes in. By the way, you create employment, because the fisherman that made his living out of killing now may realize, well, maybe if I'm the one doing monitoring on the whales, I can also make a living without having to kill. I mean, you can start to think of different ways of changing people's behavior.
That's very good. Patricia, what do you think about this, role of digital solution, blockchain, and
Thank you for the floor, Rym. I think that we need to maybe accept that people are not, all the people are not altruistic, you see. So I really believe that we need to move to a market. And I'm going to explain what I mean by a market, because I know that it's a little bit controversial, a market of the marine ecosystem services. When I'm talking about a market, I'm explaining that obviously in Chile, what we want to try to develop with the government, but also with the community and the scientific university, is to put a price and to make pay, for example, shift when they collide with the whales for this damage, because like that we can use this money to create a regulation to conserve better the marine protected area. Obviously, if a company like Merckx but other see that you have a big price, a very high price when you damage whales, obviously they are going to try to avoid that, and maybe they are going to invest in new technology in order to avoid the collide with whales, you see. So I think that we have to move with this kind of market, of new market, because otherwise it's just a blind step for any kind of industry, and they just do not consider that. And for another hand, you have to understand that for one hand, we need the science in order to understand better and better the marine ecosystem services, not only in whales, but in all the natural species in land and marine area. And at the same time, we need economists working on that, and the policymakers. If the policymaker doesn't understand that it's an urgency, a social but an economical urgency, we are going to face that with most dramatical consequences.
Thank you, Patricia. Yara, what do you think the legal framework should be going based on what you heard from Ralph, Patricia, and Sylvia? We don't hear you. We don't hear you.
Now, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right. I was saying that I would not underestimate the huge body of legal instruments that is already out there. The international community has taken very, very important steps over the last years in order to move environmental protection and conservation and sustainable use of marine life into the international legal stage. The problem that we have is one of enforcement and of capacity building, and of, yes, money in order to ensure that enforcement. I would refer to different cases taken between state against state cases brought before international judiciary bodies, such as the International Court of Justice at The Hague. There was a case, the judgment in 2014 between Australia and Japan in relation to the International Whaling Commission. and to the International Whaling Convention provisions. So these are mechanisms that are available for states to be able to remedy a situation of lack of respect of international rules. Furthermore, the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, which I served for half a decade, also had the possibility of issuing advisory opinions to better explain and interpret international rules on fisheries. As I mentioned, I didn't go into the legal regime on fisheries because that is traditionally not understood within the bioeconomy, but also I could spend hours on that. The international fisheries regimes are extremely complex and very rich, and are supported by different regional commissions, regional fisheries bodies. For example, in the Mediterranean, we have the GFCM, the General Fisheries Commission on the Mediterranean, which allows for international cooperation on fish stocks, be it within national jurisdiction or beyond national jurisdiction. So the message is simply to say that the remedies exist, but it is just a matter of ensuring that governments, especially developing states, ensure that they have the sufficient resources put towards enforcement. Because, in Palau, perhaps the example given by Ralph, you can certainly imagine that even though the marine protected areas are declared and everyone knows the political commitment that Palau has and many other SIDs to that effect and towards ensuring their marine environmental protection, unfortunately they still lack the resources to ensure enforcement.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yara. Alessandra, would you like to add any last comment on this discussion?
Yeah, of course, that there is, at least, to my view, there is, of course, a midway. The difficult thing is the mix between the different instruments. It cannot just be only legal and it cannot just be on enforcement. There has to be, as it was mentioned before, a societal change, a revitalization of cultural values. We spoke, and I think it's extremely important, of the value of life, the fact that you cannot quantify that. And of course, a series also of incentives that can help. Each one has to play its role. There was, of course, also a comment from a question also from somebody that is following us. It cannot be just only the private sector, it would be pure neoliberalism, but of course it has to be a balance within the different institutions. Of course, the public can do a lot, also guiding the system using instruments like green procurement and so on, that can indeed influence the flows and the practices that the market in a certain way has to follow.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. Now I think the time is up. I think we are already 10 minutes, even more, 15 minutes above the time allocated to our webinar today. I would like to thank you all for this really marvelous discussion. I think not only we learned a lot, but at the same time, I see that I have much more questions than when I started this webinar, and I assume that we will have a lot of work of research, collaboration to be made with all of you within our research initiative, which we would like really, and we hope that you are collaborating with us. We will get back to you and see what we can do more to accelerate from our point of view. Now, is it going to happen or not? I don't know. But at least we, as you mentioned, Sylvia, we have to be, first of all, responsible for our own actions. And then try, if we are aware, try to do as much as possible all together to enhance the awareness of the policymakers in our regions. These regions, like such as the Mediterranean and Africa, more difficult because the priorities are different. They're still really locked in what I call the livelihood. So they go and extract to be able to live. So life, it's... And this is a complicated thing because, and we need to look at it also from different perspective. I think it was a really fascinating discussion today. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Yara, and thank you, Alessandra, for this really great discussion. We will continue certainly at EMEA to enhance this research and discussions with all of you, and then we will try to contribute again from our point of view. I would like also to thank my colleagues at EMEA who have made this possible through the organization of this webinar online. I know it has been quite, difficult. I know this, especially also we are on the live stream. So this is great. Thank you all.